Lay Your Armor Down, a novel by Michael Farris Smith. Chapter 1. She moved in the solemn lamplight of the cluttered house like a vague figure of a troubled dream. She shuffled from room to room, opening drawers and closet doors and picking up things and putting them into the grocery sack. No sense or order to the gathering. A random ring and a broken bracelet from a spilled jewelry box, one shoe, a ragged notebook from the bottom of a stack of other ragged notebooks, 2 postcards from a long-dead sister, a handful of hair clips, a small wooden picture frame that held the rudimentary drawing of an angel that had been created by her child decades before. She wore a thin housecoat that hung on her aged and slender figure, her gray hair in a matted mess. She talked to herself as she moved throughout the house, reminding herself of errands that had been years ago completed and gossiping about people she no longer knew, and singing fragments of songs that had once played on the radio during the summer days of her small-town youth. In doorways, she would stop and look into the shadows and touch the tip of her index finger to her chin and hold it there in troubled thought, and then she would begin again to fill the sack with random fragments of time gone by. At the end of the hallway, the closet door was open, and the contents overflowed and spilled out onto the floor, as if the house were regurgitating its own clutter. The pace of her rambling quickened as she dropped to her knees and began to dig into the closet, as if just remembering something essential. Her arms thin and weak, but working in a sudden fever, as she pushed away dirty towels and newspapers and shoeboxes, and she burrowed into the closet. At the bottom of the pile, she found a thin red coffee can, and she opened the top and felt inside and touched the roll of cash. She kept digging, and she pulled out 3 more coffee cans from beneath the rubble, and each one held a roll of cash of various size. A savings hidden away and then forgotten and then remembered again in the swirling winds of her mind. She dropped the rolls of money into a grocery sack with the random gathering, ran her fingers across her pallid face, her eyes like deepest windows into the sprawling world. She seemed to gather herself and let out a great exhale as if arriving at a moment of resignation. She stood and straightened her housecoat, and stepped out of her slippers and brushed off her ashy feet, and then she stepped back into them and she took the grocery sack under her arm and she made for the front door. Well, she opened it, and the night wind greeted her, and she gazed out into the darkness, a traveler ready for some journey. A star-blown sky above the winding road that led from the house, and the road badly patched and bumpy as she stumbled twice but caught herself both times, cursing the uneven ground in a quick insult before returning again to the harried conversations of her lost world. And she wandered from the road and into the field where she pushed through the knee-high grass, where searching eyes busied with the hunt stopped, stared in the direction of her shuffling, and the wind pushed at her wild hair and slushed through the wild grass, and on the other side of the field she entered into the woods where the moonglow gave shadows through the trees, and where she held out her hands and touched the trunks as she moved through the forest, the dark guardians willing to give her pass. And the wind shook leaves from the limbs and they fell around her in swirls of decay as she stepped across the leaf-strewn earth, the small crunches of aged and careful steps. She was not afraid until she was deep into the woods, and she stopped and looked around, and whatever confused purpose had been there to guide her slipped off into the dark and left her alone. There was wind, and there were the calls of the night, and between the black tree limbs there were stars and moon, the heavens infinite. She leaned her back against the tree and hugged herself as if suddenly cold, and she began to cry. She cried and began walking again in no direction, moving through the woods in a confused and careful gait, and beginning to call out the names of people who passed through her mind. Names that both meant something and meant nothing. Her father and a woman she once sat next to on an airplane, and a pigtail friend from childhood, and the old man who taught her to ride a horse, and the boy who sacked her groceries once upon a time. The wind gained strength, and the limbs swayed and bent, and her hair whipped on her head, and she clutched the sack with both hands and called out to anyone who might be listening, and she lost a slipper and moved with one bare foot and panicked eyes and a deepening fear that something in the dark was going to devour her. She was lost in head and heart and soul, and she stopped and stared up at the moon, and she began to question it as if it had the answers to the universe. Who are you, and where am I, and what are we? And the questions continued and carried her as she meandered through the dark, walking into branches that scratched her face and bits of leaf and limb getting stuck in her hair, and she lost her other slipper. She was no longer crying and no longer questioning the moon, but now transformed into something ancient and mindless and driven by some ordained task, as if she was no longer of grayed flesh and bone, but instead a shapeless spirit of the wood that drifted timelessly. She moved through the night in a random pattern of wind, and then through the trees she saw the firelight. She fixed her eyes on the flames, and she pushed away low-hanging limbs and crunched across the leaves, and her mouth moved as if speaking, but she was soundless as she came into the clearing. Two crouching silhouettes next to the fire, two figures rising when they looked up at the old woman who emerged from the wood. Twigs in her hair and a torn housecoat and bare feet and stick-like legs and the distant gaze. She regarded the dark figures, and then she looked again into the star-struck night at the marble-white moon. She let her arms fall to her sides in a great release, and she spoke in some language they did not understand. She then fell silent, and the sack dropped from her hand and spilled onto the ground. A spindle of cash rolled forward and settled in the firelight, and there was no judgment among them, but for the emptiness in which they all stood. Chapter 2. They left the dying fire and walked out of the clearing, the tawny light on their backs and darkness before them. Their car parked on the roadside, a big four-door thing, long as a boat, two hubcaps missing, and the antenna snapped off. Each man lit a cigarette before climbing in and closing the doors, and then they sat there smoking and staring through the bug-smeared windshield. Something small and bright-eyed crossed the road, and it stopped and looked at the car and then continued on its journey and disappeared into the brush. Falling leaves swirled in the wind and fell in the moonlight like flakes of rust. One man sniffed and the other coughed as the car filled with smoke. The driver rolled down the window, and he smoked and scratched at his beard before flicking out the cigarette, a little red spray as the butt bounced on the road. The man in the passenger seat smoked more methodically and was still at it when the car cranked and the headlight split the dark. The big car moved in a great lurch and began its descent from the hillside, filling the night with a low rumble. They drove through the darkness, past rolling pastures lined by leaning fence posts held erect by strands of barbed wire, past gatherings of hardwoods and over skinny bridges with rotted rails where the moon reflected in the wobbled creek water. The big car cruised through the bends in the road where deer stood, and backed away and still and waiting. It rolled through the desolate four-way stops where there was nothing and no one, and they drove on with their red-tipped cigarettes across the fallen landscape of the autumn where the fields had turned the color of sand and the stars stabbed the sky in darts of silver. Neither man spoke. They emerged from the unmarked country roads and turned onto a two-lane highway. Mailboxes stood on the roadside at the end of the gravel driveways, and sleeping houses sat quiet and peaceful back in the gloom. Dogs slept on porches and raised their heads to regard the loud thing moving through the night, and then returned to slumber as the growl of the engine disappeared. The lights of the world appeared in the fluorescence of gas stations and in flashing red signals and yellowed street lamps, and then disappeared in the rear-view mirror as the car followed the highway right through the meager town and entered a new dark. 13 more miles of silence between them and pine trees and the rise and dip of the hills, and then, as if leaving one country and crossing into another, the landscape bottomed out. The car now traveled a flat terrain in a rhythmic glide, as if rolling across the serenity of lake water. Spanish moss hung from tree limbs in gray and gathered clumps, and the long and drooping limbs of the willows swayed in the wind, and the swamp slurped up against the roadside, as if only waiting for the command from some weather god to swallow what was left of the raised earth. The frame that held the child's drawing of the angel sat between them on the bench seat. The man in the passenger seat picked it up. He flicked his cigarette lighter and looked at it in the solitary light of the flame. And he ran his thumb across an angel wing. Then he set the frame back on the seat and gazed out into the night. The driver looked over at him and wanted to ask why they had bothered to bring it along, but he only gave a silent look of disgust, and his eyes returned to the road. And then there it was. The all-night truck stop sat in isolation as if it had long ago been misplaced and forgotten. The car bumped across the potholed parking lot and stopped in front of the glass doors of the diner. A handful of cats hunted around the dumpster. 2 18-wheelers parked off behind the gas pumps. Darkness closed around as if the place had been created as a sojourn for some final plummet. The neon sign read "Open" in the front window, and the bugs danced around it in the cotton candy glow. From behind bent and twisted blinds, the lights of the diner cut into the night in awkward slants. The two men sat there and stared until the man in the passenger seat coughed and shifted in his seat. "Well, ain't you going to say something?" The driver grabbed a cigarette pack from the dashboard. "About what?" The driver then looked at himself in the rear-view mirror and rubbed at his bloodshot eyes before climbing out of the car. The passenger watched as the bearded man pulled open the door to the diner and disappeared inside. "About what?" he muttered, and then got out and followed. Okay, that was a couple of chapters from a recently released novel by Michael Farris Smith. The title of the novel is Lay Your Armor Down. I ordered a hard copy of this book. Smith has become one of my favorite authors. The stories are great, and the way he writes them is just spectacular, as you just heard. He has several novels available on Amazon. I'll link his author page and a link to this particular novel in the description below. You can click on it and go straight to it and buy the Kindle copy, a hard copy. I don't know if it's out in paperback yet, but this book has met with great reviews, great sales. I read it and covered from cover to cover. I pre-ordered it. And it came to me like the first day that it was released. It showed up in my mailbox. And I read it in like 2 nights. It's just so good. Like all of his work, it's really good. So wanted to share that with y'all. Check him out, Michael Farris Smith, fantastic author. If you haven't heard me talk about him before, he's got 2 of his novels have been made into major motion pictures. He's a good screenplay writer. And he's a very talented musician as well. He's got a band in Oxford, and they do a few gigs here and there. So he's a real creative person. And hope you guys enjoyed chapter 1 and 2 of that novel. There's a lot more to it. It's 30 chapter book, but it's a great story. So you guys pick it up. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and we'll see you guys on the next one.